Hey everyone, this is David Geisler again with Norm Geisler International Ministries. Tonight we're going to talk about the topic, understanding the times. And the question we want to ask is, why is it so difficult to reach people today? Tonight, joining me is our teaching staff, Raymond Kwan, Brian Henson, Thomas McCuddy, Don Deal. Now, please note if you have any questions, we'll try to get to some of them during the last 20 minutes, but please keep your questions focused on our topic tonight. If you have other questions, go to our Facebook page and ask there, and we'll work on this and post the answers this week. If you're joining us now, please write your questions in the comments. Now, I'd like to begin our discussion tonight by sharing a little bit about my own journey in the area of witnessing, and then I'll ask the rest of our staff to share about their journey as well. I remember when I was in college, I was involved with an evangelism ministry, and I used to knock on college dorm doors, and I used a simple gospel booklet. And would you believe it? I had people pray to receive Christ just by reading a little booklet. Now, I've noticed today it's not so easy to get people to come to Christ just by sharing a little gospel booklet. Why is that? Now, Raymond, let me start with you. Why do you think that is?
Your question is saying that a little gospel check can actually, get people to pray to receive Christ. And I believe that the gospel message may be simple, but nowadays, because of erosion of truth, sharing the gospel is not as simple.
Yeah, here's a graphic we want to show you just to kind of illustrate the point that that Raymond is trying to make. Why don't you clarify that a little more for us, Raymond?
Maybe 20 or 30 years ago, we Christians and also the pre-believers will have a common ground called truth. So when we present this truth that gospel truth like God exists or the Bible is God's word, and we have this common ground of truth that we can communicate a simple gospel message to others. However, today, because of this erosion of truth, when people receive it, people have different perceptions of truth, and you may come back and say, Jesus Christ is God. Okay, so this is true for you, but it's not true for me. And in Asia, people in this context, right, people have this concept of truth means that anything is truth as long as it works. So people will say that I don't care whether it's true or not, but so long as it worked for you, and it may not work for me. So people have different kinds of perception and worldview of truth that it makes this simple gospel message so difficult to reach others.
Yeah, very good. Thomas, let me ask you a similar question. Why is it so difficult today just to use a simple gospel tract and share the main points of the gospel and have people actually respond positively to the gospel message?
Well, David, the gospel tracts, they're good. And actually, when I was in high school, for example, I had a teacher. I went to a Christian high school, and he gave me a tract, and it kind of changed how I perceive things about being obedient. But I was already primed and ready. I was already, we had so much of that common ground that Raymond mentioned that has been eroded away. So now, because of that lack, that little gospel tract is almost, we've almost been desensitized to things like tracts through social media, that the memes are the tracts of Facebook, that there's so many different ideas, cultural relativism, moral relativism, the pluralism, and everybody has their own idea. And just search anything in social media, you'll see that with this wide range, when we come with this little gospel tract, it is just one of many messages competing for the hearts and minds of people. And I think D.A. Carson also pointed out in his book, Athens Revisited, he said, we cannot possibly agree on the solution that Jesus provides if we cannot agree on the problem he confronts. And if you ask people, what is the problem in our world? we can't even agree on that. And even with, as Corona's going around, I mean, just think of all the different ideas that we have. We can't even figure out what's right in front of us. And as Jesus said, if we don't even understand the earthly things, how then are we going to understand the heavenly? And that's the challenge that I think that little track is up against.
Right. Very good. Don, why don't you add a little bit further? Why is it so difficult today, especially to share the gospel with people that would call themselves atheists? What has changed in our world to make the gospel so much more difficult?
You know, David, that as time passes, the world changes, not just physically, but mentally, the kind of mental world we live in. And each generation has to decide for itself, number one, what counts as evidence? And number two, when should I be convinced? We live in a different world now. And because of that, in the past, there was a certain viewpoint of how the universe operated and how you should think and what counted as knowledge. Now there's a philosophy that kind of underlays science, which has become so the kind of the paradigm of what counts as knowledge, called empiricism, which says basically that we gain all our knowledge through our senses, the physical senses, and everything that counts as knowledge can be measured, touched, or weighed. And supernatural can't be measured, touched, and weighed. So if they can't see and test God, then they don't believe in God. And if there's no God for them to be accountable to, then they're not so inclined to see themselves as a sinner to start with. Where if you accept the view that we all just descended from an original murky pond, as Darwin put it, to where we are now, then there are no moral absolutes that they have to be worried about keeping up with.
Yeah, it makes it much more difficult for us to witness.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember how easy it was for me in college just to share a little booklet, because for the most part, we still had kind of accepted the idea that there was a creator, that we're accountable in some way. And my father would say that many people back in the 70s would just be considered a backslidden Baptist at the very worst. And so we just need to kind of remind them of what the Bible teaches, and what the Bible teaches specifically about us. Brian, can you share with us your take on why is it so much more difficult today to witness to people?
Yeah, well, when I was in college, in the undergraduate in the 90s, I also was trained in the 4 spiritual laws, which is actually a really good way of explaining the gospel to somebody. The only problem is in the 90s when I was in school, the problem that you're talking about, that was already an issue where the average person wasn't somebody who just had a Christian worldview anymore. So I'd walk them through just the plain gospel, and whoever I was talking to wouldn't stick to the script. I was like, okay, it says here that God has a wonderful plan for your life. And they're like, I don't care. or I don't think there's a God. And I would be like, well, that's you have to think there's a God, and we're sinners. Like, no, I'm not. And so I found myself trying to convince the person that the little book I had was true, because they didn't believe that yet. And so we have to back up and do what we call pre-evangelism, because they don't have the worldview yet in place where the gospel is even receivable. So if you think about when we are talking to somebody, you have to know what the person's assumptions are, but you also have to realize what our assumptions are. So if I were to say to somebody, you know, Jesus died for your sins so that you can go to heaven. Think about what's loaded in that statement. Think of all the assumptions that we have in that very statement. Jesus died for your sins, you can go to heaven. We're assuming that spiritual truths are noble. We're assuming that there's a God. We're assuming that there's a moral law and that we've broken the moral law. We're assuming that Jesus existed and that he has the authority to atone for our sins, and that there's an afterlife, and that it's the biblical version of the afterlife. So we have all these assumptions that we're carrying with us when we try to explain the gospel. So we have to back up and try to build a bridge to the person from where they are to get to the actual gospel message itself. So if you think about it, if I'm going to say to the average person who has an Eastern worldview, Buddhism or Hinduism, if I if I say, Jesus died for your sins, you can have eternal life. In Eastern religions, they believe in reincarnation. They believe that life is the problem. If you want to stop life, meaning this physical life, you want to stop this life, you're reincarnated over and over and over again until you escape the system. So if I say somebody with the Eastern worldview, you can have eternal life, they'd be like, oh, who wants that? The goal is to stop that. And so if I say that same statement, Jesus died for your sins so you can go to heaven. If I say that to the average college student, think about his response. Is he going to be like, okay, that sounds good? He's not going to just accept all my assumptions anymore. In the 1970s, when I was born in 75, but then and earlier, you could just give the gospel. Billy Graham could get up and he could just lay out the gospel, and then all these people just suddenly start coming down because they all want to get saved because they already had a biblical worldview in place. So think about if I said that to the average college student, Jesus died for your sins, you can go to heaven. He's probably going to say something like, well, that's true for you, but not for me. And then what am I going to say? Well, it's true for everybody. Or he might say, I believe in science, not religion. Like, what does that even mean? But I believe in science too. Or they'll say, you know what? I think all religions lead to God. Like, no, only mine does. So that sounds arrogant to somebody if I said, no, only mine does and yours is wrong. And so we have to realize how we're coming across. It sounds offensive. I'm saying you're wrong. You don't have the answers, but I know the answer. So the simple gospel actually seems very offensive big time in our culture today because people don't have the Christian worldview. And somebody might even say, well, I don't even believe in God. Or I don't believe the Bible's true. Give me evidence that Jesus existed. And it's just like, goodness gracious, suddenly I have to become like this philosopher, theologian, historian, just to tell my neighbor about Jesus, or a college student about Jesus. And you don't have to be an expert, but you may have to do a little bit of homework. And every generation has a battle to fight, every single one. If you read the Bible, God was never like, you don't have to fight it all. No, everything's gonna be easy for you. God always wants his church to be challenged. That doesn't mean it's always a physical military battle, but for us, it's an intellectual battle. Everything's a spiritual battle, obviously. But it's philosophical, spiritual. It's on many fronts that we're fighting.
That's one thing that I remind young people of when I'm speaking in churches, that what they are facing and witnessing to people today is much more difficult than when I was in college, for example. And if they don't understand that, they may not understand why they're so frustrated when it comes to trying to witness to their friends. Well, let me just share a little more about my history of learning how to more effectively witness. Just some of the things that I learned back in the 90s. Some of you may know this. Actually, in 1994, I was actually hired by the graduate branch of Cru, formerly Campus Crusade for Christ, to come to the University of Texas and develop a pilot program for graduate students, because what they discovered by 1994 is that a simple gospel approach with graduate students wasn't working very well. And so I did that, but what I discovered is it wasn't just graduate students who were skeptical, that a whole new generation of skeptics had risen. And at the same time, I saw how a lot of my ministry friends, my colleagues, were using a mere testimonial approach to witnessing. And I saw, being trained by Norm Geisler in the area of apologetics, I saw the dangers in that limited approach, because others could say things like, well, it may be true for you, but not for me. And at the same time, I was reading this book by J.P. Moreland called Love Your God with All Your Mind. Now listen to what he says about this subjective approach to witnessing on page 30. He says, if truth and reasonableness are not uppermost in our presentation of the truth to a pagan culture already predisposed to regarding religion as a set of private feelings, then we'll constantly hear this response, well, that's fine if having those feelings helps you. Now, Raymond, let me just ask you, why is it that so many problems that Christians face in witnessing to people in Western culture are actually similar to the problems that you face in an Asian culture, and I faced when I lived there almost 15 years ago.
As Ravi Sakura says, we are living in a time that the West is looking more like the East, and the East is quietly imitating the West. You know, just like the coronavirus, right? It started in Asia and it spread through the world. This new worldview, we call it postmodernism and pluralism. Basically, it's the erosion of truth and rejection of moral absolute, and all these things that my colleague has mentioned about has spread through East and West alike. And culturally, it's very, very obvious, right? My friends and my colleagues in Asia, they are no longer watching Eastern TV. They watch Netflix. They follow stuff from Hollywood, and also people from the West. So we start looking at some of the worldviews in the East, like Eastern mysticism, and they practice yoga, meditation. I remember that I witnessed to one of my colleague who is from Britain, and he has a physics PhD. So I started talking to him about cosmological argument. He agreed with me that the world has a beginning, and anything that has a beginning needs a beginner. So the universe has a beginner. Then I want to actually share with him further that, okay, so what does it imply? Does it mean that there's a creator of this universe? Then he answered to me that, yes, but how do you know that the world has only one beginning?
Oh.
And after that, I find out that he's a Buddhist.
Yes. So it has become more difficult in Asia. And Raymond, I remember 15 years ago, when I taught in the seminaries there in Singapore, I had one student at East Asia School of Theology. Listen to what she said one day about her problems in witnessing. She said this: many students don't think that there's a standard of right and wrong. This is in Asia, this is in Singapore. Rather, they believe that it's up to the individual. This means that they do hold to a standard of right and wrong themselves, but they feel that each person's standard of right and wrong differs from the other. And then she went on to say this: personally, I feel stuck as to how to proceed on with the conversation. It's like saying that the food is nice for me, but it may not be nice for you. And then she said, they relegate the standard of right and wrong to a personal preference. And so the same kind of problems that we're facing in the West here, I find that you're facing in Asia as well. And it really is true that East and West are blending together, making our task more difficult. Can you think of some examples, Raymond, of things that have happened recently in your life and witnessing to people where you kind of see that similar attitude that people have in Asia?
Yeah, definitely. People generally have a very deep skepticism about proclamation of absolute truth. For example, like when we talk to people about, Jesus is Son of God, and many people will accept that, but they don't have problem in accepting Jesus as Son of God, but they have a problem in accepting Jesus is the only Son of God. Because when we witness to especially the older generations in Singapore, right, that they already have this pantheon of gods, right? They worship Wan Yin, they worship, the whole lot of different goddesses. They have no problem in accepting Jesus as part of their belief system, but they have problem in accepting Jesus is the God, the Son of God, and they have problem in accepting Jesus is the only way. So when we talk about this in Asia, especially, right, people will say, who are you to say that Jesus is the only way? And especially in Singapore, there's a multi-racial and multi-religious country, and people have this view that all the religion equal, all the religions actually basically teach the same lesson, and it makes reaching out to people from different worldview much more difficult.
Yes, it's so true. Don, let me ask you this question. I told you I read this book by J.P. Moreland over 20 years ago, Love Your God with All Your Mind. And there are a couple quotes that are very meaningful. I just want to mention these and then ask you a question about it. He says on page 21, as we approach the 21st century, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to recognize that our entire culture is in trouble. We're staring down the barrel of a loaded gun, and we can no longer afford to act like it's loaded with blanks. And then on that same page, he says this: a major cause of our current crisis consists in a worldview shift from a Judeo-Christian understanding of reality to a post-Christian one. So my question to you, Don, is as you think about what has happened in our world, what has changed in the history of Western thought to make witnessing more problematic? And maybe we can bring up the graphics to help illustrate the point you're going to try to make here. And by the way, next time, if you join us in our discussion, you can get the free downloadable PDF summary and the images from this discussion.
Well, David, what we've done in the last several hundred years is we've moved from the pre-modern world. If you look at the graphic, we're moving from the left to the right side of the screen there. First century to the 17th century on up to the 21st century. On the left side, the ancient times of the pre-modern world. We move from there to the modern world, and the scholar Thomas Oden, he dates the modern age. He dates it from the fall of the Bastille at the French Revolution in 1789, exactly 200 years later to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. For him is the end of the modern age. And then we move to the postmodern age. So you move from the pre-modern world where theism, that is, there's a personal God who interacts with the world. And we began through the Enlightenment period to change to a more of a deistic God, that is a God who created the world but doesn't interact with it, to the modern world of those periods when you get naturalism, which is nature is all there is, nihilism, the ending of all true values, and existentialism, where you basically create your values and God is gone. And you move to the modern, the postmodern world of pluralism, where you just, whatever you think goes. So you move basically from a society in which the church is the center of the society in the pre-modern world, the modern time where society and the church are two separate things. And you can see that in our Constitution and our own government. And then you move to the postmodern world where the church is just one aspect of society. That is, it's kind of like there's a big, you're at a restaurant and you get to choose various items to put on your plate, and you just put whatever version of that you want in your plate, along with your politics, your sports teams, your television shows, your movies, your friends. So we've moved from a God-centered society to we've completely pushed him to the outmost reaches of our society.
You may know that my dad had a very interesting way of explaining the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern period in terms of a baseball umpire. He would say the pre-modern umpire says this: I call them like they are. The modern umpire says, I call them like I see them. And the postmodern umpire says, they ain't nothing till I call them. And I think that's a pretty good bird's eye view of what has happened in this period. Now, for all of those who are joining us and you have questions about this particular topic, write them down and send them to us, and we'll try to get to them soon. Thomas, let me just ask you, what would you say are the two key characteristics of living in a post-Christian world, a postmodern world, that makes our task more and more difficult today? What are they, and maybe describe that a little bit more?
Part of what we've been talking about is in this post-Christian world is religious pluralism and the postmodern, which first of all, religious pluralism, as we've been talking about it, and I think one of the best illustrations I got when I was in college was a lady I worked with in one of the computer labs. She came in one day and she said, I heard the best illustration today. God is like a flower, and he's the center, and all the religions are the petals on the flower. And she says, "Isn't that beautiful?" And I said, "Yeah, it's just not true." I didn't know what else to say. This was before I studied, and these experiences are actually what led me into apologetics, because I felt like, that there is truth, but the postmodern system is that there is no absolute truth. And I came across that. I was a math major in college, so all my friends at the university, they were Muslims, atheists, and Hindus. That was the majority of the department. And even among them, it was just a matter of whatever. Even as I was sharing in some of the comments, I met an Iranian-born, Turkish-raised atheist. She was over here in the States, and I asked her, "Why are you an atheist?" She's like, "This is just what works for me." And so she was very relativistic. I learned that word for the first time, and I thought I had her. I said, "All right, look, so anything can be God." And she said, "Yeah, whatever makes you happy, whatever, all paths lead to God." And I said, well, I took my cell phone, or maybe it was a pager back early in that day, and I stuck it out on the counter, and I said, "Well, could this be God?" And she said, "Why not?" And I was like, "That's not what you're supposed to say." And years later, it would be your dad who told me that everyone can smell a rotten egg, but not everybody can lay a better one. And so this represents like that just doesn't make sense. But that's what happens in postmodernism. If there is no absolute truth, everyone gets to determine that. And when it comes to the religious pluralism, any way is as good as any other getting to God. Another illustration, they say, like, God is like the mountaintop, and all ways lead to the mountaintop. And some of the ways that we can sort of answer this, going back to the flower illustration, is the problem with all these religions is the center of the flower has a rose petal, a daisy petal, and maybe part of a dandelion. It doesn't. That flower is not viable. It doesn't work that way. And when it comes to the mountainside, all paths lead. I was like, well, there's one path that'll get you straight up. That's the waterfall, but you ain't getting up that way. That's not, again, I think that's in some of the ways how in the church, in dealing with these and the resistance to persuasion, being able to take their ideas, and instead of, "No, that's not right, that can't be right," to say, "I think you might have misunderstood the situation."
Very good. Hey, Don, just to kind of add on to what Thomas mentioned, can you talk a little bit more about postmodernism? Define it for us. Tell us what are the key characteristics that will help us to recognize that when we see it, and then tell us how you would handle this kind of barrier when you're trying to witness to other people.
Sure. The funny thing about postmodernism is that many people use the term, but there's actually no commonly accepted definition. There's certain trends within it. It's a recent movement. It's characterized by skepticism. A lot of people are skeptical. You recognize that in every conversation these days, it seems. Subjectivism, that is, everybody has their own truth. That truth isn't discovered, it's created within us. And relativism, that every viewpoint's equally value. Suspicion of reason and sensitivity to how our ideology controls how we assert and maintain political and economic power. That is, if you assert something to be absolutely or objectively true, it's interpreted as a power play where you're trying to impose your worldview on them. So it's not an actual movement in itself, but more of a reaction against modernism. We talked earlier about how modernism kind of gets traced back to the French Revolution, and that was supposed to bring about a revolution through the use of science as a technique and reason. So science and reason in the modern age were supposed to bring about a utopia. The communist regimes of the 20th century were based on these ideas that communism was the scientific way to run your country. But people saw what these ideas led to. Science led to the atomic bomb. Reason alone doesn't lead to morality. The communist regimes of the 20th century responsible for the death of over 100 million people. all the violence that gets blamed on religion, and there's a lot of it, but nothing comes close to what the atheist, what the modern scientific rationalist did within the communist regimes. So basically, people are looking for a new way of seeing the world, but they one that doesn't have an authority that tells them how to think. How do we overcome this? Well, you can't break down a wall that somebody's erected inside their mind by attacking it from the outside. The way to do it is, as you and your dad pioneered in conversational evangelism, is through questions. If you can get them to break the wall and pull out the foundations from within, then it begins to weaken. Simply attacking that wall from the outside with reason and logic is just seen as a power play. So asking questions that cause them to surface doubt within them, that's the way to reach the postmodern.
Very good. So let's talk about for a moment the implications of postmodernism that affect the receptivity to the gospel. Some of you may know that I actually teach these principles in my seminary class. So let me just list these and then we'll talk about them. Number one, postmodernists tend to feel free to construct their own knowledges and realities. Number two, they believe that persuasion is prohibited. You see how that would be difficult for us when we're trying to witness to them if they don't think that we have the right to persuade them. Number three, they believe that to be exclusivistic is to be arrogant. Number four, they believe that our belief that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life is just one of the narratives among so many other narratives, like the Da Vinci Code and Dan Brown, in the world that are equally as valid. And number five, their pluralistic mindset gives them no internal motivation to hear about Jesus. Now, Brian, why does that make it more problematic for us when they have those kind of beliefs?
Yeah, well, when they have beliefs that are blocking the gospel, it makes the gospel seem irrational and it's unacceptable. For example, if somebody doesn't believe in God, they're not going to think that Jesus can rise from the dead. If you have heard Bart Ehrman, the famous professor at Chapel Hill, when he talks about the resurrection argument that Christians give, he'll say, well, historians don't have access to what God does, so you can't argue that Jesus rose from the dead, because he presupposes ahead of time a loaded definition of historian. He defines a historian as somebody who only studies natural events of the past. And so if somebody has that presupposition ahead of time, you're going to have to uproot that and then replace that with the proper worldview. And that's why one of the things that we talk about is worldview replacement. The worldview replacement would be you discover what somebody's worldview is, what are their basic beliefs, what are the philosophies that they have, and then you slowly start, through conversations in a gentle, loving, respectful way, start dismantling the foundation, the worldview that they have, kind of like, as you see in the movie Shawshank Redemption, that very slowly he's chiseling away that tunnel in his wall, and then he has to take the dirt out right under the noses of the guards, and then he just dumps it outside day by day. That's kind of what you're doing to somebody's worldview, bit by bit. And that's a friend of mine in college who led me to the Lord. His name was Derek. And I see my friend Pete from college is actually watching our show. I saw him there. So Pete knows who I'm talking about. He's in the comments of the show now. My friend Derek, he was this great godly man, and I was not a Christian, but he didn't come right out and tell me, you're a sinner, you're obviously not a Christian. He actually would just talk about sins in his own life. He would talk about his own shortcomings. He wouldn't say you're a sinner. He would just talk about the fact that he was a sinner, and he would say, I struggle with these kind of things. And I saw myself as a Christian. I thought I was a Christian, and I kept thinking, I am not as moral as this guy is. And he holds himself to a really high standard. He kept on talking about his sins. And what he was doing is, bit by bit, he was causing me to get rid of my foundation, that my worldview, my basic worldview foundation I had was that I'm a good person. God will receive me because I'm good. And he slowly started sneaking in this other foundation, and I started to take his. I was like, you know what? I do way worse things than this guy does. And I think that I'm highly moral, and he doesn't think that about himself. So I started to see myself differently. And so all the different worldviews that are out there, like if somebody has the naturalistic worldview, they think that nature is all that there is. You can, in your conversations, just ask them, well, you know, if nature can account for everything, can nature account for nature? Was there anything prior to nature that acted and caused nature to begin to exist? Or if they think all religions are true, you can just ask them, well, in fact, I had a professor, an undergraduate, who was my favorite professor, by the way, and I had him for my world religion classes because I was a religious studies major. And I thought he was an atheist because he had a critical view of the Bible. And one day I asked him, I asked him if he was an atheist, and he said, no. He said, I believe that all religions are true. And I was shocked. I was like, wait, what? Because he was very critical of a lot of religions. He said, I think that they're all true. And I started asking him questions about things I learned in his class. And I said, because I became a Christian my freshman year in undergraduate. And I said, well, if they're all true, why do they all disagree? If God started all the religions, because that's actually how he explained it, that God actually used all the different religions to reach all the different people. I said, well, why did he tell the Christians that he's triune and tell Muslims that he's not triune, and then tell Hindus that they are him, and then tell the ancient Greeks that, no, there's lots of finite gods, but not an infinite God? Why did he tell everybody there's a different salvation plan? It's through works? No, it's not. It's through animal sacrifices and Jesus, and through knowledge and enlightenment. And why did he tell us all something different about the afterlife? That, oh, you're reincarnated over and over again, but except for Christians, they go to heaven. Or except for, you can reach nirvana, go back to Brahman. And so it didn't, and I said, how do you account for that? And his answer was, I'll never forget what he said. He said, Brian, that is the one question I've never been able to answer. I thought, that should be the one reason why you shouldn't believe that. And so worldview replacement would simply be that you ask them these questions to slowly start getting them to think about their worldview, so you can start, taking the dirt out and throwing it out in the yard, in the prison yard. And after a while, they realize, oh, I have a Christian worldview now. And then that's when they're ripe for hearing the gospel.
Yes. Let me switch the conversation a little bit. Some of you guys know there's been a recent Barna poll, and it revealed that almost half, 47% of all Christian millennials think that sharing your faith is wrong. And yet 94 to 97% of those millennials agreed that the best thing that their friends and loved ones can do is come to faith in Jesus. Now, Raymond, why do you think there's such a disconnect in the world today? Looking at, for example, that statistic, what is that saying?
I don't think 47% of millennial thinks it's wrong to share the faith. I think 47% of millennial thinks that it's wrong to share the faith in the way that they have been taught. In today's generation, people are so used to sharing, right? Like if you like a Facebook page, you share with your friends. Everybody has a story to tell. But this is not the way that they are taught to share the gospel, right? People are taught to, follow spiritual laws, or, that Jesus is the only way. So the way that people share the gospel must change. Instead of sharing a propositional truth, people are actually people will get offended or reluctant because we may sound narrow, exclusive, and arrogant. But if we change the way to share the story, right? That by having a conversation with them, just like what you taught me in conversational evangelism, by listening, observing their barrier, and asking good questions, people may be open to reconsider their own worldview and remove their own obstacle of truth from within. Just like I had a conversation with my atheist colleague, right? That he told me he don't believe in God because it's lack of evidence. Instead of pushing all the Christianity, all the evidence of Christianity down to his throat, I asked him one question. I asked him, So what evidence do you have for atheism? Then you think very hard and think about a very long story, and then in the end he find out that he doesn't have any basis for his atheism. He told me that, Raymond, I don't have any evidence for my atheism. It's just my own belief. You see, by asking a simple question like that, we can allow the people to actually reconsider their own worldview and destroy their own obstacles by themselves.
Yeah, very good. Thomas, being a former pastor, I'm just curious, what would you want pastors to understand about witnessing today that maybe some pastors don't understand, and so makes their task in equipping others a little more difficult?
I think sometimes we forget, and I've encountered this as I teach at a Bible college and I teach many pastors. We tend to be in a bubble, and we tend to be around people who we all generally think the same. There might be some differences here or there, and especially for pastors who were trained 20, 30 years ago, the culture has just changed radically, and they may not have noticed, or it might have been a case where those methods that they used, and maybe the people even sitting right in front of them in the pews, they can say, look at all these people that came to Christ through what we did. But the culture's changed so much that they forget that fruit that they had before doesn't have the new fruit that we should. We're not reaching the people. And even sometimes when people are coming, and that old system of, hey, people are coming and they're sitting there and they're listening, I think that they forget that in witnessing to the truth isn't just making Jesus known, it's also people understand who he is and receiving that. And that old mantra of, we're making Jesus known, we're making Jesus known. I think for many people in our country, in our world, they may know exactly who Jesus is. They may have heard the name. They might be very confused. And I think what happens also is we try to witness, we forget that people are often rejecting a Jesus we don't serve through all the confusions. And that even if they do say, yeah, I know exactly and can recite the gospel and all that, now, hey, that's great. But they've never received that. They've never actually put their faith. And that was actually my problem when that's what kept me out of the faith for the longest. I always believed Jesus was real, and I believe God was real, and I believe Jesus died for my sins. I just didn't ever submit to that. I never put my faith in Jesus. And I think my concern as a pastor was always making sure and following up. And that's why I think that as preaching, as pastors, as preaching is important for the life of the church, but conversation is so much more important for the life of the believer, and teaching believers to have these kinds of conversations, because the world has changed. And I think in so many ways, we're still doing good in our circles. We're still doing good in our churches. But we've got to be that salt and light. And sometimes, just like when you have to maybe pull the chain again or turn a different light as the day changes and the light shifts so you can see clearly, I think one of the things we failed in the church to do is adjust. We're not shining a new light, but we might need to shine that light in a new way, changing our methods without changing the message.
Very good. Very good. Hey, Brian, why don't you go a little deeper into the question I just asked you about worldview replacement? Explain a little more. What is it? Why is it so necessary? And what are some things we need to keep in mind in using this concept and witnessing to people today?
Yeah. Until they have the proper worldview, they're not going to believe in things you're saying. If there's no God, then there's no, then he can't write the Bible. Then the gospel's not true. If they have an anti-supernatural presupposition, then they assume that miracles don't happen. And so if you're trying to get them to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and they're like, miracles don't happen, but Jesus died and rose from the dead, like it's not even a possible option in their thought process. So you might as well just be telling them that there's fairies that live in the forest, because it just seems false and outlandish. And if you're trying to tell them that there's a hole in their boat, one thing that I hear you say, David, is you'll say, if you try to tell somebody there's a hole in their boat and they need to get out, they're not going to get out of their boat and into your boat unless they're convinced that you're giving them a better boat. And so they're not convinced that we're giving them a better boat. They think, no, there's a way. They may say, yeah, I know that there's holes in my view, but yours is worse. And so I would say there's a lot of Christians that have questions about their own faith, and they may even have that same position and think, I have holes in my boat because I have questions that I can't answer about the Christian faith. But they think, well, there's a lot more holes in the atheist boat and in the Islamic boat. And so if you kind of keep that in mind, that's actually what they're thinking too. And so you have to kind of persuade them and get them to see that there is a hole in their boat, and that your boat and theirs, but not in yours. And so if they believe that the material world is all that there is, that there's no material or immaterial beings, if they believe that you don't have a soul and you're trying to tell them that that Jesus died to save their soul so they can go to heaven, they're not going to believe that. And so suddenly you'll find that your conversations are like, they just get so like abstract. You're trying to argue for the souls of this guy and that. But people are worth it. And so I would say that it's worth studying, and there's plenty of resources that NGIM has to offer. So I would say that, if you look at the guys on the screen, a lot of these guys up there have done the legwork for you. So contact us, go Thomas up there. Thomas is running the Institute. If you want to take classes, there are plenty of training that we would love to do. If you're talking to a Mormon, they might believe that God is material. If you're talking to a Muslim, they might assume that, there's no way that God can become a human. And so these are things that they're going to have to deal with before the Christian faith is even an option in their thought process. One thing I like to do is I like to talk about movies. I mentioned that before in here. I think that's a great way to strike up conversations with people. That if you notice, the best movies have good versus evil. You can clearly see this is the bad guy, this is the good guy, and there's a battle to fight. There's some kind of a hero. There's something that you want the main character to be redeemed or to do the redeeming. Why is that? Why is it that we by humans naturally cling to these certain themes? It's as though we're designed for it. And so conversations like that, where you can start trying to point to design.
Excellent. Yeah. So what I'd like to do, we have a few minutes left. If you have any questions, feel free to send them in. But I want to just help you to think through how can we more effectively witness to postmodern people. And I just want to name a few things and then ask a few questions. And I just want to throw it out to anyone of you guys to answer this. As you keep in mind witnessing to postmoderns, here's some things that I have found helpful. One, we need to remember that our convictions about Christ can come across as arrogant to some people, especially living in a postmodern world. How can we do this practically? Anyone?
David, if you don't mind.
Sure.
It's right there in the text, 1 Peter 3:15, with gentleness and respect. I work with Muslims many times in discussing matters, and in that part of the world that the Islam grew up in, hospitality and humility are the greatest virtues, and the biblical world isn't that far away, Israel and such. And so I believe that Americans come across as arrogant in general when we're witnessing to people outside America, and Americans, Christians come across even within America as arrogant because we say we know the truth and everybody else is wrong. And people take that sometimes as we're up high and we're talking down to people who are below us on the spiritual scale. They believe you have to earn your way to heaven by being good, and that what we're telling them is that we're better than them. And that's just such a bad way to think about it. You give the analogy of the One beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. That's the mentality. That's the humility. That's the bringing Christ with us every day and living Christ in our hearts that we need to embody as part of this. It's how we live our lives that show Christ in us.
Very good. Well, let me just throw out a question that was sent in. Someone can explain, what does the erosion of truth mean? We were saying that basically that it's more difficult to witness to people today because of the erosion of truth, and we put up that graphic, and that kind of graphically illustrates really what has happened in our culture. Who would like to explain that further? Raymond, do you want to take a stab at that? Oh, Thomas, go ahead.
I'll take it, David.
Go ahead.
I think that again, to maybe look at it from a different angle, that kind of historically what's happened, especially in America, is the Judeo-Christian worldview in America kind of reigns supreme from the beginning, but over time there's this slow erosion away. And one of the ways we've seen that, like, just think about television. Think about, like, in the old black and white I Love Lucy, that there were separate beds, like, just in the kind of moral understanding. You couldn't show even a married couple in bed. Then all of a sudden, they were in bed. And then, you fast forward and you get people like, Archie Bunker, and you just see this erosion in TV morally. I think the same kind of thing happens concerning truth, is that there was a shared understanding, that worldview. We saw the world kind of in the same way, that there was this understanding that when people didn't believe in God, back in the day, for many people, what that meant is they didn't put their faith in God. Like, I have family members who are like that, who they say, well, I know this, I know that, but they don't believe. And so today it's no longer I know that, like we said, now it's based upon feelings, or the concept of well, this world is obviously just a random chance, or even the ideas that now are acceptable, kind of like the ideas that we can kill children and it's not that bad, as long as there's these circumstances, or we can do these things. That's all part of the moral erosion, the whole worldview erosion. We've seen it over time. And I think that's why I mentioned, like, with pastors, they have to be aware of this. Where are we standing right now? What does it look like right now? We can't operate from the way things used to be. And that erosion of truth, that whole concept of truth is abstract. I know what it's like on a rock erodes,
Right.
but those foundational worldview ideas, there's a rising a generation that's not heard those things, and for the most part, many of them, they don't care. And if we're going to evangelize effectively in a world like this, we got to know what ground we are standing on. And we also have to know where the solid rock of Jesus Christ is. And then we can build those bridges from where people are back to the solid rock of Jesus Christ that does not erode away.
Very good. Here's another question. Can more than one religion be true? Don, will you want to take that one?
Oh boy, do I. They can't. They can say that there's a spiritual reality that could be true in common, but when you disagree about who and what God is, what happens after you die, what does morality mean, how do I get to a good place after I die, how do I worship properly, all those questions are answered differently. Some religions have no concept of God at all in it. It's simply religious philosophy. Some religions, the central focus is submission to the will of God. There are just so many different answers. Is the Judeo-Islamic idea of God as one person, one God correct? The Trinitarian Christian idea is the pantheistic God who is the universe, or the panentheistic God who is the spirit of the universe. There's just so many different conceptions. There's a reason all those religions have different names, and that's because they're different. So that, no, the law of non-contradiction says they cannot all be true in that sense.
But we would definitely want to say that there could be aspects, minor
Right.
aspects of
Yeah.
religious beliefs that we do agree with, like every religion probably has some form of the golden rule that we would agree with. So there are some things we agree with, but the essential doctrines of the Christian faith, those are things that are contrary to every other religious.
Yeah, I would say there'd be like kind of like a hierarchy of the different faiths where Christianity has the most truth, and I say that only because there's disagreements within Christianity on certain aspects of our faith.
Right.
So we have the most truth, and we have the gold standard, and other religions, in as much as they agree with Christianity in those aspects, that they all have aspects of truth. I mean, nobody gets fooled by a counterfeit dollar bill that's purple. It has to be a lot like the original in order to make people fall for it, in a sense. I'm not saying all the religions are simply fake. What I'm saying is that they're modeled on the original and the central faith.
Right. So we have another question here. Brian, let me ask you this question. What advice would you give to the relativist basic arguments? Like, how would you, I guess the question is, how would you respond to a relativist in their arguments? How would you help them to see that everything can't be relative?
Right. Well, what I learned as an SES student, Southern Evangelical Seminary, is how to identify a self-defeating statement, a self-defeating truth claim. That relativism is just full of self-defeating positions. If somebody were to say, well, that's true for you, but not for me, or there's nothing that's true for anybody, the classic comeback is what? Is that true for everybody?
Right.
So if somebody says, well, everything's made out of matter. They have the materialist worldview. Would say, well, is materialism made out of matter? If an atheist says, I don't believe anything unless I can see it, unless I can use science to discover it. Well, have you seen atheism? What does it look like? Have you used science? Can you use scientific method on atheism, or can you use a scientific method on science itself? So you got to learn how to pick out a self-defeating statement. So you look at the belief or the statement, and then you hold it to its own standard. Like if I said all religions are true, if I had that position, then somebody could ask me, let me put it the other way so it's easier to explain it. If somebody told me all religions are true, I might say, well, is my religion true? And they would have to say, yes. And then I could say, well, but my religion says yours is false. Now what's he going to do? He's going to say, well, it's arrogant of you to think that my religion to other religions are false. I'm like, wait a minute, are you telling me I'm wrong? You're being arrogant and you're hurting my feelings because you're saying that I'm wrong, that I shouldn't have that position. So relativism says that whatever you believe is true for you. And really it's because one thing you got to keep in mind is a lot of times somebody may have the relativist position, not because they're trying to be evil, but a lot of times it's because they don't want to be confrontational. They just want everybody to get along and say, you have your position and I have my position. And they haven't really thought it through. Okay. And so you may want to just ask them questions about their position, and then you can see if it's self-defeating, but don't be a jerk about it. You definitely want to be very kind and respectful as you're showing that it's self-defeating, because it can really be embarrassing if somebody catches you on a self-defeating statement.
Yes. Now we only have time for one more question, so let me just ask this last question and then I'll wrap this up. The question is, how do we ask someone about their worldview questions in a way that's respectful to them and their values? I think that's a great question, actually. How do we ask others about worldview issues or questions in a way that shows respect for their beliefs and their values? Who would like to answer that one? All right, Don.
Sure. It's a matter of the personal touch. You don't come in and you don't ask it in a challenging way. You ask it as one friend talking to another friend. I'm just curious, how do you see this issue? Typically, moral issues, political issues are really good ways to get into those sorts of questions. And then you can start to gently ask them questions that allow them to see for themselves that there's major problems with their worldview, like some of the things Brian mentioned on the empiricist or the scientism type worldview, that everything's answered by science. Or, the famous thing is the David Hume quote about, if a book contains abstract reasoning or whatever, metaphysical reasoning, consign it to the flames.
Right.
His book contained nothing but that. He was telling,
Right.
basically, it was self-refuting. So
Yes.
the point is not to get in their face and show them they're wrong. The point is to establish a relationship through which you can ask questions and help them to understand and see for themselves that there's issues.
Very good. Well, I'd like to close tonight by sharing a quote, one of my favorite quotes from J.P. Moreland's book, to kind of wrap up what we've been talking about tonight, and to actually introduce what we're going to talk about next time in 2 weeks when we do another streaming. J.P. Moreland, in his book, Love Your God with All Your Mind, says this. He says, how is it possible for a person to be an active member of an evangelical church for 20 or 30 years and still know next to nothing about the history and theology of the Christian religion, the methods and tools required from serious Bible study, and the skills and information necessary to preach and defend Christianity in a post-Christian neo-pagan culture? Now, this was actually one of the questions he raised when I read this over 20 years ago. It was one of the catalysts, actually, for me starting my own ministry over 20 years ago. And tonight, we talked a little bit about how we can preach and defend and proclaim Christianity in a post-Christian neo-pagan culture. But we haven't really talked about what's happened in our world, what's happened to Christians because of what's happened in our world. And that's what we're going to talk about next time. We'll talk about what practical steps we can take to help turn the situation around in our own lives, in our churches, and our ministries. The Bible says in Psalms 11:3 that when the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? And unfortunately, because of postmodernism, our foundations have been destroyed. The Bible also says in 2 Timothy 4:3-4, for the time will come when men, and I should add women as well, will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. And then it says they will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myths. And if that doesn't describe postmodern world we live in, I don't know what does. I think that you would all agree, guys, that we need to be like the men of Issachar in 1 Chronicles 12:32, who understood the times in which they lived and knew what they should do. And I just want to encourage all of you to join us next time in 2 weeks. From all of us here at NGIM, we'll see you next time. Good night.